next speaker, we've been pretty close the past few years, and it all started off with a small meeting at a lecture that Professor Robert Lustig was doing, and from then on we've been good friends and strong colleagues as well. And he's such an inspirational guy that sticks to his guns, knows the evidence inside and out, and you couldn't have anybody better to be an ambassador for this community. It's Dr. Aseem Malhotra.
Thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody, for coming, making an effort. What a great conference it's been. Hasn't it been fantastic? And, I want to take this opportunity because this could not have happened with all the hard work of Sam Feltham. So I think he deserves a round of applause. So on to more serious matters. Peter Bruckner, just now, he talks about the fact that he feels, or has felt at times, to be ashamed of his profession. And I empathize with Peter. I've also felt the same. And the reality is that the system has become so corrupted by vested interests that for me, honest doctors can no longer practice honest medicine. My father yesterday talked about National Health Service becoming a National Illness Service. That's what it's become. But how good is that illness service? How good? What are we doing for our patients? How are we practicing the best way we possibly can practice medicine? And I'm going to talk for the next 30 or 40 minutes on why I believe that we're not doing that and why we could do a lot better. Just to start, I think it's important, there's one slide just to try and, we are here to try and practice evidence-based medicine. David Sackett is considered probably the father of evidence-based medicine. And this triad, I think, is crucial for us to think about as we move forward. Are we actually fulfilling these components? So individual clinical expertise when a patient comes in, best available clinical external evidence, and are we acknowledging patients' values and expectations? If we do all of these three together, then we can have improved patient outcomes. But the reality is we now have an epidemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed, misled, and unwittingly harmed patients. And there are a number of factors behind this. This is because of biased funding of research, so research that's funded because it's likely to be profitable, not because it benefits patients. Biased reporting in medical journals, biased patient pamphlets, biased reporting in the media, commercial conflicts of interest, defensive medicine, and last but not least is medical curricula that fail to teach doctors how to comprehend and communicate health statistics. So let's give you an example about financial interests, so culture to do more. So the system has within it a culture where there is a financial incentive to carry out more investigations and procedures, and that can often put profits before patients. One extreme example in the United States, one US cardiologist was jailed for ordering $19 million worth of unnecessary investigations and procedures. Is this just the tip of the iceberg? Absolutely yes. In America, they have a fee-for-service model that contributes to overuse. In the UK, it's not to the same level or extreme, but certainly there is a similar fashion because we have something called payment by activity, which is basically, payment by results, which ultimately translates into payment by activity. Just to give you an example, in the States, it's estimated because of unnecessary coronary stenting, so this is putting heart stents into people with stable heart disease, unnecessary stenting estimated to cost US healthcare around $2.4 billion a year. But what makes it worse is the fact that we have a very large accepted body of evidence from randomized controlled trials that putting a stent in a patient to prevent a heart attack actually doesn't improve prognosis. It doesn't prevent a heart attack or prolong life. But 88% of patients undergoing the procedure thought they were having it done for that very purpose. I trained as an interventional cardiologist. I've done thousands of angiograms, hundreds of angioplasties, and when the evidence became apparent, I did my best, obviously, and I will always do my best to tell patients the truth. But the reality is it doesn't happen. It's not explicit as often as it should. And perhaps more disturbingly, 43% of cardiologists, when anonymously asked, said they would still go ahead and do the procedure even if they felt it wouldn't benefit the patient. And obviously there are other drivers as well. New technology comes in. Doctors get excited about using new technology, better stents, for example. And then obviously there's the asymmetry of information about what the doctor knows and what they translate to the patient. So a few years ago, in 2013 and early 2014, there were two editorials I wrote. One was in the British Medical Journal initially, and then later on in JAMA Internal Medicine. And the first one in the BMJ, I alluded to the fact that no demographic or individual was immune to this misinformation. In fact, the article I started in the BMJ was pegged upon the fact that the ex-president, George W. Bush, had been reported in the States to receive a coronary stent, despite the fact he had cycled 100 miles a week before. There was no report of him having any symptoms, and what was reported was he essentially went for a routine check and ended up with a heart stent. Now, I don't know the specific details about what happened, but my guess is it was very unlikely that the ex-president was told it was not going to benefit him in terms of preventing a heart attack or prolonging life. A few months later, I wrote a similar editorial about some new technology being brought in, being invited to write by Rita Redberg, the editor of JAMA Internal Medicine, in that journal. That was press release and made some news headlines and picked up by the BBC here. And I basically said that this procedure carries a risk and we should just tell patients the truth. There was a little bit of a backlash. The British Cardiovascular Intervention Society were quoted in the BBC News story saying there's no evidence of inappropriate procedures going on in the UK. The issues I raised were that, one, the way to combat this overtreatment and potential harm is make it mandatory on the consent form. When we consent patients for the procedure, we have to tell them there's a risk, but we don't tell them the true benefits or lack of benefits. And what that would do is it would encourage a more informed decision-making process, reduce anxiety, and also it can encourage conversations about other things patients can do, which is what I do when I speak to my patients in terms of lifestyle changes. You've got a stable plaque in the artery. It's not going to necessarily cause a heart attack. There are medications that help. Lifestyle change is probably more effective. We can encourage this sort of conversation. I do it all the time. It does not take long, and it does not take long to tell patients that stents don't improve prognosis in stable disease. The other aspect as well, which can't be ignored, is that the procedure itself, and we have to tell patients this, carries a 1 in 100 chance that it will cause a heart attack, stroke, or death. And in my career, and I've assisted in thousands and done many myself, I have seen patients, when you do so many procedures, you see complications happen, who have died on the table or had a stroke, who, if they were told the actual truth before they underwent the procedure, may have made a decision not to undergo the procedure and would probably still be alive today. So when I made this, when I wrote this editorial on JAMA Internal Medicine, there was a little bit of press around it. And then, there was this question about no evidence of inappropriate procedures or no evidence that telling patients this will make a difference. What I didn't predict was actually, a few months later, JAMA Internal Medicine carried out their own study, and they actually put this scenario to patients, see would it change the decision-making process, and it did. When you told patients there was a lack of prognostic benefit, instead of about 70% of them electing to have the procedure, it got reduced to 45.7%. And they calculated across US healthcare, if every cardiologist had this conversation with their patient, which I said is free, doesn't take very long, it would save US healthcare $864 million a year, just from this. Looking at the bigger picture about modern medicine, more medicine is definitely not necessarily better. So Jack Wenberg, who's a researcher in the States, has done a lot of work in this area, basically found out from his own study that in areas of the United States where there was more medical care, more expensive care, there was actually worse mortality outcomes. And we know that, and there were a number of factors behind this, and we know, for example, if you compare the NHS to the US, they spent more than twice the GDP we do on healthcare. It's about $4.2 trillion a year that's spent in healthcare in the US. Yet they have worse outcomes for health. So it's quite obvious that too much medicine is causing a problem. It's wasteful and it's also harmful. And there's also an issue about ethical considerations at end-of-life care. So in America, in terms of end-of-life care, of almost 2 million elderly beneficiaries who died in 2008 of the fee-for-service Medicare, 30% underwent an invasive surgical procedure in their year before death, almost 20% in their last month of life, and 8% undergoing a procedure in their last week of life. Now, is this ethical? Are we practicing ethical medicine? It's something we need a discussion. It's a cultural problem. I don't think it's about individuals to blame and pointing fingers. It's a system failure. And what Jack Wenberg concludes in his research, he says, getting beyond the more medicine is better assumption will require a national debate on the limitation of medicine's power to heal and cure, and more of a discussion on the quality of care at the end of life. Okay, doctors' misunderstanding of health statistics as well is a big problem. So just to give you one example, many doctors actually do not understand health statistics and therefore cannot evaluate evidence for and against a treatment. So in a study of 150 consultant gynecologists, a third of those did not actually know the meaning of a 25% risk reduction created by mammography screening. Most of those third believed that if all women were screened, 25% or 250 out of 1,000 less would die of breast cancer. The reality from a Cochrane review is actually you have to screen 2,000 women to save one life. It's a big difference there. In a smaller study a few years later after the Cochrane review, not a single person who was surveyed, a consultant gynecologist, was actually aware of the harms. So for every one person that you save from screening 2,000, 10 women will receive an overtreatment, either an operation or a drug they didn't need. Now, what's the solution to this? The solution is here. Why not have that transparent, open conversation with the patient and help them make the decision? Patient might come back and say, listen, I'll actually decide I don't want to have a screening. Somebody may say, I've got a lot of fear about it, I'd rather go for it. But at least have that conversation with the patient. That's not happening. And in my view, that's completely unethical. So there are many ways of presenting statistics. So a little bit of a short lesson here. It's actually much simpler than we think. So it can either be relative risk, absolute risk, or NNT. So communicating relative risks as opposed to absolute risk or the numbers needed to treat can lead lay people and doctors to overestimate the benefit of medical interventions. So let me give you an example. Based upon published research, industry-sponsored randomized control trial data on using atorvastatin 10 milligrams in type 2 diabetes patients, if they take that drug every day for 4 years, you can say to the patient, there's a 48% relative risk reduction in you taking this statin and you having a stroke. Atorvastatin 10. What does it actually, what's a more transparent way of actually interpreting that and having that discussion? Well, the reality is if you look at that RCT data from where that's come from, what happened was instead of 28 in 1,000 people having a stroke, 15 in 1,000 did from taking atorvastatin 10. So an absolute risk reduction of 1.3%, or another way of saying this is an NNT of 1 in 77. So the other way of having this conversation with patients, which is what I do when I can, when I've got the information available to me, is saying, okay, if you take this statin, 10 milligrams every day for the next 4 years, there's a 1 in 77 chance it will delay or prevent you having a stroke. How different is that to 48% relative risk reduction? It's completely, so now, it's not just an abstract thought. The misinformation goes all the way to established and reputed medical journals. So mismatch framing in medical journals also makes this situation worse. So if treatment A reduces the risk of developing disease from 10 to 7 in 1,000, but increases the risk of the harm of disease B occurring from 7 to 10 in 1,000, the medical journal article will report the benefits as a relative risk reduction of 30%, but the harm is 0.3%, absolute risk. 1/3 of all medical journal articles published in The Lancet, the BMJ, and JAMA between 2004 and 2006 actually use mismatch framing in the reporting of the results. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out, obviously, that's going to lead people to feel that there's an exaggerated benefit and there's a minimization of harms. So don't just take my word for this. The man who's probably considered the world-leading researcher on health literacy, Gerd Gigerenzer, in a bulletin that you can see online, you can go to it, it's freely available. In 2009, a World Health Organization bulletin says, it is an ethical imperative that every doctor and patient understand the difference between absolute and relative risk to protect patients against unnecessary anxiety and manipulation. So in other words, I would argue that unless you have this conversation with the patient, we are practicing unethical medicine. We're also using biased information to make clinical decisions, which I'm going to come on to next. And therefore, it makes it very difficult for us to truly practice ethical medicine. So let me give you a case study. And this is where one of a journey for me on the whole statins controversy, which I'm about to come on to next, and I'm sure a lot of you are very interested in, started. So give you an example. 49-year-old man comes into outpatients having had a stent, emergency stenting for a heart attack, which is life-saving. And he basically reports disabling chest pain, which was atypical. It wasn't typical of what we think is cardiac. We didn't think, when he saw me, he didn't, it didn't sound like it was cardiac. I discussed it with my colleague. I was a specialist registrar at the time with my consultant. We made sure, obviously, there's no acute problem, no heart attack happening. But just to be on the safe side, let's repeat the angiogram. Okay, let's just have a look and make sure the stent's not blocked off or there's no new blockage. Angiogram takes place, stent's fine, everything's fine. He's on the table, I do the angiogram. But doc, what's causing my pain? I'm reassured there's no new blockage. Typical, reaction often is, oh, this could be something else. It could be a bit of acid reflux giving you the chest pain. Here's a proton pump inhibitor. Okay, off you go to your GP. We'll see you in clinic, and I'll write to your GP, and your GP can follow you up and see what's going on. Patient's reassured, comes back with a review in 6 weeks, and he comes back in, and at this point, he's now also got muscle pains, but the pain is still there in his chest. He's actually very depressed with it. The GP can't get to the bottom of it either, and has now referred him for an endoscopy, an upper GI endoscopy, a camera to look at the esophagus and see whether there's an ulcer or something else. So I speak to my colleague again, and he said to me, Aseem, this could be a long shot, but I have come across patients occasionally that get chest pain, but the muscle aches as well. It could be the statin. So we make a decision and say, okay, well, I chat to the patient and say, listen, why don't you just stop your statin for a couple of weeks, and let's see what happens. If the statin's causing a side effect, you'll get better. If not, then just go back on the statin. So he's advised to stop the statin. He's now in outpatients. You can't see the patient much more quickly. Obviously, GP can look after him. So he's got an appointment to come back in another 3 months. But he actually turns up a week later, uninvited, he knows I'm in the clinic, knocks on the door. He's elated. Thank you, doctor. He's been depressed for months because of this disabling pain. After months of misery, my pain had disappeared, but now I'm worried. My GP said, you must never stop your statin or you could die. Now, what do you think his risk of death from stopping a statin is for 2 weeks? Someone who's got established heart disease, had a heart attack, if we accept there's benefit there, which I'll come on to a little bit more later, what do you think the risk of death is from stopping statin for 2 weeks? Any guesses? 0. Okay, somebody knows something I don't, obviously. It's very small. Best, worst case scenario, 1 in 10,000 maybe. Okay? So, but again, the misinformation there. I'm sure the GP felt genuinely that this was potential harm, but no. So he's better. Okay, so let's move on. October 2013. Myself and John Abramson from Harvard published 2 articles in the British Medical Journal, now the BMJ. John Abramson and colleagues in Harvard had done a reanalysis of the published data on statins in low risk to assess what the true benefits were, based upon already published data on people at low risk of heart disease with a 10% risk of cardiovascular disease in the next 10 years taking a statin. And what they concluded from their analysis was basically that statins do not prevent death or serious illness, if you're in that category. There's a 1 in 140 chance that taking a statin every day for 5 years will prevent a non-fatal heart attack or stroke, non-fatal. But what he also said is a risk of potential harm. As well as we now know there's about 1 in 100 chance, if not slightly more, of type 2 diabetes developing from taking a statin. He had written, and we had both cited the same observational study, that around 1 in 5 or 20% of people taking a statin will have side effects that include muscle symptoms, muscle pain, cataracts, liver inflammation, all that kind of thing. I had written an article in the BMJ which made a lot of news headlines around the world. It's quite overwhelming because the BMJ press released my editorial but not John Abramson's. I'd said something similar about statins. We've over-medicated millions of people. I said we need to be discussing numbers needed to treat, be more transparent with patients. This article was mainly focused, however, on the fact that we've overly focused on saturated fat as a cause of heart disease, and we should be placing the blame on sugar. And that was really the main headline. But I'd also cited, by coincidence, exactly the same study that John Abramson had cited about statin side effects and said about 1 in 5 will have unacceptable side effects. Unacceptable not to the doctor, unacceptable to the patient, because that's what's most important. So this got a lot of press coverage, as you're probably aware, October 2013. And leading up to March 2014, Professor Sir Rory Collins of Oxford, considered probably the leading statin researcher, or one of the leading statin researchers in the world, had actually contacted the editor of the BMJ. I was made aware of this. And he basically had asked for both our articles to be retracted because of our claims on statin side effects were not evidence-based. And the editor of the BMJ, Fiona Godley, had quite correctly said, well, listen, we're very happy to publish your critique. Most people don't get the opportunity. We will publish it in our journal, publish a full critique, and then let this debate continue. For some reason, Professor Rory Collins didn't want to do that. He just kept saying, retract, 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 sending emails to Dr. Godley. So this was ongoing. In the meantime, there was a rapid response in the BMJ, and actually, when we look back at that paper, there was a few caveats that perhaps we should have mentioned, but really, it was a distraction in my view. So the study that we cited looked at over 100,000 people in the community who were prescribed statins by their family practitioner. And 17.4% in the notes had documented that they'd stopped their statin because of side effects. There was a considerable number, maybe about 30%, who had not gone and seen their doctor and stopped the statin, so we don't know. And a lot of patients within that 1 year period had either changed their statin or gone back on a lower dose, and we only know up to about 1 year. But this was what was taken out of proportion, and we made that correction or caveat. You can judge for yourself whether you think we'd exaggerated considerably, and we're going to move on a little bit more, and you make your own conclusions in a few minutes. But basically, that's what he was having an argument about. So we made those corrections, made those caveats, but that wasn't good enough for Professor Collins. So in March 2014, the front page of The Guardian, I get a phone call from Sarah Bosley, the health editor of The Guardian, a few days before this made front page news, as well as the BBC. And this was a quote that was written in the Guardian newspaper in March 2014, calling for retraction and basically suggesting that what me and Abramson had written could cause considerable harm, far worse than the MMR scare by Andrew Wakefield. Okay? And this is what was quoted. He said, there were only one or two well-documented problematic side effects from statins. Myopathy and muscle weakness occurs in 1 in 10,000 people. And there was a small increased risk in diabetes. Okay. Statin controversy continues. So while all this was going on, this call for retraction, myself and a number of prominent doctors wrote a letter to the Secretary of State for Health. So this included the then President of the Royal College of Physicians, Sir Richard Thompson, who was also the Queen's doctor for 21 years, personal physician to the Queen, chair of the Royal College of General Practitioners, and basically we wrote that what had actually happened in the interim is NICE had come out with a guidance to say that we should now be prescribing statins. In essence, GPs should be financially incentivized to give statins to people at low risk of heart disease. After all of this was happening, about this whole, even though, and what's interesting, Professor Collins did not challenge the claim that was made by Abramson that there was no decrease in mortality based upon his analysis. That wasn't challenged, it was all about the side effects issue. So we wrote a kind of letter of protest which got widely publicized, and we made a few points. You can look that up online if you want to look in more detail, but these are the issues that we had with the NICE guidance. Most of the people on the guideline panel had direct financial or institutional ties with the drug companies that produce statins. The side effects were not taken into account. The issue about type 2 diabetes, if you're going to basically subject millions more people in the population to taking statins. Increased GP appointments as well, cholesterol check, coming back. I mean, system is already under a lot of pressure, and now we're prescribing a statin with a financial incentive attached to it that's only going to make the situation worse, is what we felt as a group of doctors. And we still don't have access to the raw data. This is a drug that's been prescribed for, 30 years? Hundreds of millions of pounds of research funding gone to various institutions, including Oxford University, to fund this research, and they hold on to the raw data, and there are lots of questions being asked, and we don't have access to it. Again, what happened only very shortly after, the General Practitioners Committee also took heed, and they said that actually, in light of the fact that when we got access to raw data on Tamiflu, which was a drug that we spent, considerable amount of money, hundreds of millions on, stockpiling, to basically for a flu outbreak, which we then found out actually wasn't that beneficial. When they reanalyzed the data, they were able to get access to the raw data. Until we have access to the raw data, GPC said, from statins, then we asked NICE to refrain from recommending a reduction to the current treatment threshold until we have access to the raw data. The articles, editor of BMJ, Fiona Godley, then sent both articles. She said there was a lot of media attention around it. Okay, let's send this for an independent review, because she was very honest, and I respect her for a lot for that. She said, we have a vested interest because we publish these articles by Abramson and Malhotra, and therefore we're going to send it to an independent review. And it went for an independent review, and in a sense, myself and Abramson were on trial for about 2 months. But actually, in that 2 months, I was still helping and coordinating this letter to NICE, because I knew there was something not right going on here. This was a distraction. This was trying to silence critics. It wanted to shut us down. And as far as I was concerned, I could see very clearly that's what was happening. That's what I thought was going on. And we came back. There was 6-0 in our favor, independent review, no need for retraction. Okay? So this was time to start actually, were we going to sit back and keep quiet now? We were scared, we don't want to push this any further? No, absolutely not. Now, around the time of the BMJ piece that was published in October 2013, what was very interesting, by complete coincidence, a lot of you will be aware of this, in Australia, there were 2 programs that happened in conjunction by an investigative science journalist called Marion Damasi. And they were called Heart of the Matter. One was about saturated fat and cholesterol and heart disease. The other one was about statins. And there was a lot of overlap and similarities with what both myself and Abramson had written in the BMJ. Abramson was actually featured in one of these documentaries. And he got a lot of attention in Australia. And around the time of that going out, at the same time as our pieces, there was a reaction from some of the establishment figures. I won't name them individually. You can look it up if you like to. But basically suggesting that as a result, similar to what Professor Collins had suggested, as a result of the scaremongering about statin side effects, people will die. Many people may die, stop their statins, high-risk patients, etc. And in June 2015, so Marion Damasi actually, what ended up happening was they ended up retracting one of her documentaries, not because of any factual inaccuracies, because the industry and various vested interests had really put pressure on the ABC, and they said there was too much bias in favor of our view versus the industry view, and it ended up getting retracted. There was no grounds for retraction. Everything was factually correct in that her documentary. So it's really quite scandalous in my view that happened. Anyway, so this got retracted. Things move on. ABC in Australia are aware of what's going on in the UK and the fact that we're winning a battle over here about transparency and about the fact there is a backlash from certain sections of the medical profession, establishment figures, respected figures, saying that this is a wrong approach. And they then commissioned another documentary, which obviously didn't happen. And a few days before Marion Damasi was due to come over and interview various people in the UK, the Medical Journal of Australia, the #1 medical journal over there, put out a press release and a paper, and they concluded from this paper, as a result of the documentary in Australia, up to 2,900 people in Australia may have suffered a heart attack or died as a result of stopping their statin. Guess what? This was all extrapolations. There was not evidence from any registry data, no noise that you see in hospital admissions or anything, of a single person suffering a heart attack or dying and stopping their statins because of this. And even if there was, very difficult to prove that it was because of media, scare stories, what else is going on. But there still wasn't wasn't even an anecdote. And something similar happened here. And I was predicting this. I thought, this is going to happen here. There are people that are going to try and use a medical journal, often a marketing vehicle, really. That's what the reality is. Medical journals are often just marketing vehicles for the pharmaceutical industry. Be under no illusion. The Lancet are very culpable of this too. Be under no illusion, this is actually the reality. But anyway, I predicted this would happen over here. And actually, this is what happened as well over here. They predicted all these thousands of people may be dying, etc. There isn't evidence of a single anecdote. Now, in cardiology circles, everybody talks. So you always hear a story of something amongst cardiology circles. Believe me, I would be the first person to hear about it if that happened. I haven't heard anything. Now, that isn't to say we should stop taking statins, but let's use evidence here. Let's have a more transparent, and it's a distraction from actually having an honest and open discussion with patients, in my view. What's interesting is a month before the Medical Journal of Australia put this press release out, its editor-in-chief was sacked for objecting to more commercial influence over the journal. Professor Stephen Leader, I spoke to him as well and clarified all of this. Not only was he sacked, what they didn't expect, the board, is that 17 out of 20 members of his editorial team after he was sacked resigned in protest. Now, this should have been the main headline news in Australia, but it was published in the Sydney Morning Herald, and you could read it if you look at it online. This is a major issue. This is a major issue. This was not discussed in mass media, which it should have been. So I've always argued the case about the issue about statins in low risk, and that's where I think the evidence or the discussion should be more transparent. I've handed out statins like Smarties, and to some degree have still done for many years, because I've treated thousands of people in my career with heart disease and heart attacks. And on ward rounds, you go around and you put them on high-dose statins, and you basically tell them that, you know, this is a life-saving drug. You don't talk about side effects. That rarely happens. I still don't do that. I only look for it if they come back in with problems. But we prescribe patients as this is a life-saving drug. Now, Michel Delorgeril is a very reputed cardiologist in Grenoble in France. He was actually the lead researcher behind the Lyon Heart Study. He's also a nutritionist as well. And this was really quite extraordinary. And he wrote a paper in January 2016, and he put all of the statin trials together and looked for various discrepancies. How can you, he's understanding how data can be, how should I put it, massaged to look more impressive, etc. And his conclusion, and he was very open about this, is that he felt the evidence from all the major statin trials, he believed that actually even in secondary prevention, people may not benefit. Now, I'm not saying this, but I think it's really quite extraordinary that somebody like him has come out, and he has no vested interest in this, to actually say he believes that the current claims about the actual true efficacy, benefits, not side effects, and side effects of statins is not evidence-based. Richard Thompson, in response to all of this as well, what was going on in terms of the way Marion Damasi had been really silenced and attacked over in Australia, he actually supported her. And he said that we need an independent inquiry because the situation has actually gone to such an extreme level, especially around the impartiality of so-called medical experts that are funded by the pharmaceutical industry who have a lot of influence and power. Now, let's just take a step back for a second. Peter Wilmshurst is a cardiologist who done a lot of work over a number of years, who have brought people to justice in the medical profession and reported a lot of doctors to the GMC for things like research misconduct. A very brave man. And he actually started off his career working with the pharmaceutical industry and realizing when one drug company tried to bribe him for not publishing results that showed harm about one of the drugs that he had been researching. And he basically, his career has really revolved around this and greater transparency. And he gives a talk in the Centre of Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford 2014, and he makes some very cold, hard truths that I think we should always just think about now as we move forward, because we have to change the system. And he says, one, pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies have a fiduciary obligation to shareholders to make a profit and make a shareholder dividend, but they're actually not required legally to sell consumers the best treatment. Although most of us would believe want this to be the case. The real scandals, he says, and I agree with him on this, is that regulators fail to prevent misconduct by industry, and that doctors, institutions, and medical journals that have responsibilities to patients and scientific integrity collude with industry for financial gain. Is he the only one who's got concerns about this? Well, let's talk about innovation. We're talking about all these new drugs coming on. You hear all the headlines, some new drug coming, new advances in heart disease treatment, etc. Of the 667 new drugs that were approved by the FDA between 2000 and 2008, only 11% of them are truly innovative. 75% were essentially copies of old ones. So drug companies change a few molecules here and there with the drug, they patent it, people work out a little bit later on that actually it's no better than the previous drug, but they've spent a lot more money on it, and the cycle continues, and that's a problem. And that's not surprising. I mean, there's also evidence to suggest that actually in some respects, drug companies spend almost even 19 times more on marketing than they do on research and development. So when the financial model is like this, how are we going to get new blockbuster great drugs if the system actually perpetuates this issue? Again, come back to what Michel Delorger and Peter Wilm says. So this quote is from Marcia Angel, former editor of New England Journal of Medicine, says it's no longer possible to trust much of the clinical research that is published or rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. And I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reach slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as editor of the #1 impact medical journal in the world. Richard Horton himself, editor of The Lancet. Okay. in 2015, in an offline editorial, actually responding to a meeting he'd attended with some senior research scientists, said possibly half the published literature is untrue from what they told him. And obviously there are lots of recent scandals as well that the former editor of the BMJ reported and wrote in an article, and he was in a conference where he basically asked the audience of researchers, how many of you are aware of research misconduct going on or have gone on in your own department or institution? And a third to a half put their hand up. He said, how many of you have reported it? All of them put their hand down. Okay, let's move on a little bit. So just coming back to statins, I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered about side effects. I'm just going to state some facts. So the largest statin survey in the US, which looks at over 10,000 people, found that in the community, people prescribe statins. This is before media hype, so before so-called media scaremongering. Almost 75% of people who are prescribed statins within a year stopped them. And side effects was the leading reason that they cited in America. And 62% of them actually said it was because of side effects. And 3 out of 10 of those respondents said they experienced side effects, and 34% of those will stop taking the statin because without consulting their doctor. So there's a lot that just feel afraid of going back to doctor saying, I've stopped my statin. You told me this was a miracle drug, this will save my life. You understand why a patient might be a little bit anxious about having that conversation with their doctor that they've stopped their statin. Statin controversy continues. Sunday Times investigation, September last year, finds something very interesting. So we know Professor Collins, who's led a lot of the research in Oxford, had actually published a paper in The Lancet to, again, try and bring more clarity to the statins issue, and said that not more than 1 in 50 now will suffer side effects that talk about muscle pain, according to their review. What Sunday Times had written is that, Professor Collins, who believes millions more Britons should benefit by taking statins, is also a co-inventor of a test that indicates a susceptibility to muscle pain. Okay, interesting. The test that was branded as Statin Smart was directly sold to the consumer in the United States with Boston Heart Diagnostics, who that have license for it, for $99. Under the claim on the website, 29% of statin users will suffer muscle pain, weakness, or cramps. Okay? Royalties of the licensing to the patent can be used to fund university research, but Collins and his co-inventors have waived personal fees. Okay. Boston Heart Diagnostics, in this controversy, when the Sunday Times was doing this investigation, they actually stood by their claims because Professor Collins said this was misleading, this 29% figure. They actually said that a US task force on statin safety had concluded that randomized controlled trials, such as those used in the Lancet study led by Collins, had major limitations because patients with statin intolerance were often excluded. Okay, so what do we know? There's a patent, for whatever reason, he may have a good explanation for this. This was invented several years ago, okay, by Professor Collins, on a test that tests for a gene that tells you whether you're likely to get muscle pain from statins. Apparently statin side effects don't even exist. So I don't understand what's going on there. And money has obviously gone to Oxford University. So with permission, John O'Good Thomas, investigative chief reporter for Sunday Times, has allowed me to use this next slide to show you that in an FOI request to Oxford University, the Oxford University has received a total of £369,772.74 from the sale of this testing kit, and the CTSU has received £126,000, including £96,000 that would have. Okay. Now, I find this very puzzling. Very, very puzzling. Okay, let's move on. So we've got some obviously concerns and questions that need to be answered. Too much medicine is a problem. I'm pleased to share that the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, that represents essentially most doctors in the UK, also believe it's a problem. And they started a campaign called Choosing Wisely to wind back the harms of too much medicine. I wrote a paper, analysis paper in the BMJ, along with now who's the current chair of the GMC, Terence Stevenson, and the chair of the Medical Royal Colleges, Professor Dame Sue Bailey, to say that we really believe this is a real problem in UK healthcare. We need to do something about it to reduce the harms of too much medicine. I'll just move on because time is short. And I think one of the things that the medical royal colleges say as well, thinking about the bigger picture, is that we have an ethical responsibility as doctors to reduce waste in resources, because in this finite healthcare resource system, one doctor's waste is another patient's delay. And we've made some call to actions and next steps to encourage also doctors and patients to have more transparent communication with patients to reduce harms, and also to discuss other simpler, safer options when they come in with certain chronic diseases, whether it's type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure, and specifically that's going to be lifestyle changes. Okay, just almost getting to the end now, just to put things in perspective a little bit about numbers needed to treat for common treatments for heart disease. I'm a cardiologist, so just looking at death, if you take aspirin every day for 5 years and you've had a heart attack, there's a 1 in 100 chance taking an aspirin will prevent or delay or save your life. For statins, based upon the published research, if you're somebody in the clinical trial who adheres to a statin every day for 5 years, obviously it doesn't have side effects, in that group, selected group of people, there's a 1 in 83 chance that it will save your life or delay your death if you take a statin if you've had a heart attack. So these are people who have had heart attacks or heart disease. Aspirin and statins at low risk, no benefit in terms of mortality. You're not going to live 1 day longer. Stents during a heart attack emergency procedure, 1 in 40 chance. Stents at any other time, you know now that it will not reduce your, prolong your life. But based upon, I know it's limited information, but based upon RCT data that we do have, the most powerful coronary intervention tool in secondary prevention is the Mediterranean diet with an NNT of 30. And interestingly, this trial, which was done by Michel Delorger, the Leon Heart Study, compared the Mediterranean diet with the standard American Heart Association low-fat diet, which is actually still probably a much healthier diet than what a lot of people are consuming in terms of processed food. So that benefit was comparison to still quite a healthy diet and showed an NNT of 30. But most people don't know this, and this is part of the problem. This is a lack of transparency in the system. And we can only improve quality in healthcare when we have more transparency and where everybody knows, the patient, the doctor, the nurse, the healthcare assistant, that putting a stent in for stable disease is not going to prolong your life, but adopting a Mediterranean diet will probably do that. So until we get this, we can't have proper quality care. Now, briefly, just to move on, this is the other bigger issue, okay? We have too much medicine, at the same time we've probably detracted from more important lifestyle changes, and we have a major public health care crisis with obesity, the costs of which are pretty astronomical. Type 2 diabetes itself is costing a lot more. 20 billion to the economy due to lost productivity and NHS care from type 2 diabetes. That's set to hit £40 billion by 2035 if we fail to act. But it doesn't matter because, you can take a statin, of course. Doesn't matter what you eat. This is not just a joke. I know cardiologists and doctors who actually believe this. One cardiologist I know, who I respect a lot, actually said very honestly, he says, if you can't be bothered to do exercise like me, you can take a statin. Honestly. But people actually genuinely believe that. Doctors believe that. This is part of the problem. But this is not evidence-based at all. This is complete nonsense. It's unscientific nonsense. Okay, processed food environment definitely is probably one of the major risk factors behind why we have this problem. I think if we sort the processed food environment out, we will be much further on. It's very difficult to avoid wherever you go, whether the high street, even health clubs and gyms, you go to the petrol station, cheap, sugary processed food is everywhere. And it becomes very difficult to avoid eating those when you've got just such an avalanche, if you like, of processed food. And it limits our ability to make healthy choices. Now, for me, the biggest scandal and where my journey began on my campaign to try and help tackle this obesity epidemic is the fact that we've even allowed our hospitals to become a branding opportunity for the junk food industry. And for me, when I started my journey, I'd done an emergency stent in the middle of the night on a 50-year-old chap. Next morning, I'm talking to him during the ward round about a healthy diet, stopping smoking. He gets served a burger and chips while I'm talking to him about this. And he says, "Doc, how do you expect me to change my lifestyle when you're serving me the same crap that brought me here in the first place?" Bit of perspective, poor diet now contributes to more disease and death than physical inactivity, smoking and alcohol combined. So really the hierarchy in terms of where we should be focusing on if we're going to overcome this problem is going to be diet, diet, diet. All the other things, exercise of course is very important, but in terms of obesity and related diseases, the biggest problem is going to be poor diet. But what constitutes a poor diet? I've also been on an interesting journey of research, and a lot of people that are here today, that have also been part of this this movement and revolution, if you like, whether it's Zoe, who is not here right now, and Jason Fung and Andreas, who have all been part of this. Sam, all of you coming together and sharing knowledge and information, basically end up taking me and Donald O'Neill, who produced Serial Killers, to the original village where Ansel Keys conducted his research. Now, this village in southern Italy still has an average life expectancy for male and females of 90 years old. And we went there to try, and we made a film some of you may have seen called The Big Fat Fix. And we went there to try and look at what were the secrets from this village where Ansel Keys spent a lot of time that have been forgotten or lost. How does that tie in with what we know about independent scientific evidence around type 2 diabetes and carbohydrate intolerance, etc.? So we made this film, and in the next couple of weeks, I'm pleased to announce that a book based on this film is coming out, and it's called The Pioppi Diet. It'll be out on June the 29th, and what it does is it brings everything together in terms of the science and really produces a 21-day plan, if you like, to concentrate on health primarily, but as a side effect, it will also help obesity. And many things that you're aware of already. I'm preaching to the converted here. Saturated fat does not clog the arteries, and we explain why that is. Eating fat does not make you fat. And I think last but not least, but most importantly, dietary changes are more powerful than any drug, both for preventing and treating heart disease and type 2 diabetes. Now, Christian Barnard, perhaps regretfully, towards the end of his career, the pioneering heart transplant surgeon, said, "I've saved the lives of 150 people with heart transplantations. If I'd focused on preventive medicine earlier, I would have saved 150 million. Turns out the Pioppi diet lifestyle is that medicine." Thank you very much.